It was early 1943 in the steaming jungles of the Southwest Pacific. Japanese convoys were moving freely, their ships filled with supplies and troops heading toward New Guinea. American bombers tried to stop them, but their attacks were weak, inaccurate, and costly. Then one man, a maverick engineer and combat pilot named Pappy Gunn, decided enough was enough. He wasn't going to follow the rulebook. He was going to rewrite it, and what he built out of the ordinary B-25 bomber would terrify Japanese sailors for the rest of the war. Imagine a medium bomber flying barely above the waves coming straight at you, its nose packed with the machine guns spitting fire. That was Gunn's creation, a flying gunship that could rip apart ships, trucks, and airfields alike. Nobody in the Pacific had ever seen anything like it before. Even the Japanese called them devil bombers. But to understand how these monsters came to be, we have to go back to the desperate early days of the Pacific War, when the Allies were losing ground and innovation became the only way to survive. When World War II broke out in the Pacific, the United States found itself unprepared for the kind of brutal air war that followed. The Japanese Air Force dominated the skies with its agile Zero fighters and experienced pilots. American bombers, like the B-25 Mitchell, were powerful but designed for high-altitude bombing, far from ideal for the low-level attacks needed to hit enemy's ships and supply lines. Missions were often failures. Bombs missed. Crews didn't come back. Something had to change. That's where Pappy Gunn entered the story. He wasn't a typical officer. A former Navy pilot turned civilian engineer, Gunn had lived in the Philippines before the war and ran his own airline. When Japan invaded, he helped evacuate civilians and secretly move supplies for the U.S. military. Eventually, he joined the Army Air Forces. But unlike most, he didn't care about rank or red tape. He cared about results. His colleagues called him stubborn, fearless, and brilliant. If something didn't work, Gunn would tear it apart, rebuild it, and make it deadly. The standard B-25 was originally armed with a handful of defensive guns and bombs dropped from altitude. But Gunn had a bold idea. Why not turn it into a low-flying, heavily armed ship killer? He started experimenting with adding extra .50 caliber machine guns to the nose of the aircraft, giving it the firepower of an entire squadron. The brass back at headquarters thought he was crazy. This wasn't in the manuals, and nobody had ever modified a bomber like this. But in the jungles of New Guinea, manuals didn't matter. Survival did. Pappy Gunn's workshop was anything but ordinary. It was a makeshift field hangar filled with spare parts, salvaged guns, and aircraft stripped for experimentation. With the help of local mechanics and daring pilots, Gunn began cutting holes in the B-25's nose and mounting extra machine guns. First 4, then 6, and finally up to 8 forward-firing guns. He removed the bombardier's position, replaced it with ammo boxes, and reinforced the nose to handle the recoil. What he created was no longer a bomber. It was a gun platform capable of shredding enemy ships in seconds. The results were astonishing. During early test runs, Gunn's modified B-25s flew so low over the ocean that saltwater spray hit the windshield. They would roar in at wave-top height, unleashing torrents of gunfire that tore through ships, trucks, and anything unlucky enough to be in their path. Japanese crews, unaccustomed to such aggressive attacks, panicked. They had never faced bombers that came at them like fighters. Reports described scenes of chaos, ships turning violently to escape, anti-aircraft gunners firing wildly, and fires spreading across decks before bombs even hit. Word spread quickly through the Pacific. The Americans had built something new, something terrifying. Even veteran pilots were amazed by the weapon's power. Gunn's design inspired official interest from the top brass, and soon his field modifications became factory standard upgrades. North American aviation engineers took his concepts and began producing new variants of the B-25 with solid noses and up to 14 machine guns, earning them the nickname Gunship bombers. The transformation was complete. What had once been a high-altitude medium bomber was now a low-level, high-speed ship destroyer. But Gunn's genius didn't stop with just the guns. He also developed new attack tactics that perfectly suited his creations. Instead of approaching targets from high above, his pilots came in fast and low, sometimes below 200 feet, strafing decks before releasing bombs. These combined attacks devastated Japanese convoys. The mixture of speed, surprise, and sheer firepower left little chance for enemy ships to respond effectively. One Japanese officer reportedly wrote that facing these attacks was like being hunted by flying dragons that spat fire. Gunn's modified B-25s saw their first major success during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943. In this battle, Japanese ships carrying thousands of troops tried to reach New Guinea. Pappy Gunn's bombers, flying under General George Kenney's 5th Air Force, launched a devastating low-level assaults. The combination of heavy machine gun fire and skip bombing tactics turned the sea into a graveyard of burning ships. The results stunned even the Americans themselves. 8 enemy transports and 4 destroyers were sunk. Japanese commanders were left speechless, unable to understand how medium bombers could inflict such destruction. For Pappy Gunn, it was personal. Every innovation, every modification came from his determination to give his men a fighting chance. He had seen too many pilots die because their planes were underpowered or outdated. He wanted aircraft that could fight back, hit harder, and survive. His unorthodox methods clashed with military bureaucracy, but his success was undeniable. Even senior leaders like General Douglas MacArthur took notice of his contributions, often calling on him personally for new ideas. Gunn's philosophy was simple. If it doesn't work in combat, it doesn't belong in the air. He believed in practicality over perfection. Every nut, bolt, and gun on his modified planes had a purpose. He didn't care about design awards or rules. He cared about keeping his men alive and defeating the enemy. And in the unforgiving skies over the Pacific, that mindset made all the difference. By the end of 1943, Pappy Gunn's modifications had completely changed the way the U.S. conducted air operations in the region. His innovations influenced not only the B-25 program, but also the development of other low-level attack aircraft. The success of his designs inspired engineers and pilots alike, proving that one man's creativity and courage could reshape the course of an entire air war. As more of these 14-gun monsters entered service, the Japanese began to dread the sound of approaching engines. Convoy after convoy fell victim to these fearsome gunships. For the Japanese Navy, it was a nightmare from which they couldn't wake up. And it all started with one man's refusal to accept limitations. By mid-1943, the Pacific War had entered a brutal, grinding phase. The Japanese still held strong positions across the islands, their supply lines running deep through the Pacific Ocean. Every ship that reached the front meant more men, more weapons, and more time for Japan to fight on. But now the Americans had a new weapon: Pappy Gunn's flying gunships. These modified B-25s were unlike anything the enemy had faced before, and their arrival would change the rules of aerial warfare. The transformation of the B-25 from a medium bomber into a ship killer didn't just happen overnight. It was the result of countless nights spent by Gunn and his team, hammering, welding, and testing. They added armor to the front, repositioned fuel tanks for balance, and mounted as many as 14.50 caliber machine guns. Each of those guns could fire nearly 800 rounds per minute. Multiplied across the nose and sides of the aircraft, the volume of fire was staggering. It wasn't just a bomber anymore. It was a flying fortress of bullets. When these modified planes dove toward a convoy, the noise alone terrified anyone below. The Japanese soon learned to fear the low, droning sound of engines skimming the waves. Unlike traditional bombers that appeared thousands of feet overhead, these new B-25s came roaring in just above the waterline. The first sign of attack was a line of spray from bullets tearing through the ocean surface. Before anti-aircraft gunners could react, their ships were already being shredded. Wooden decks splintered, ammunition exploded, and crewmen dove for cover as the gunfire ripped across the ships. Then, just seconds later, the planes dropped their bombs, skipping them across the surface like stones, straight into the sides of ships. It was a devastatingly effective tactic. This technique, known as skip bombing, became one of the most effective low-level attack methods of the war. Instead of dropping bombs from high altitude, where accuracy was poor, pilots approached at 200 feet or lower and released their bombs at high speed. The bombs skipped across the water and slammed directly into ships before detonating. When combined with the new gun-heavy B-25s, skip bombing turned the aircraft into both a strafing and bombing weapon in one. The Japanese convoys had no real defense against it. Their anti-aircraft guns couldn't track planes flying that low, and their fighter cover was too far away to help. The first real demonstration of Gunn's ideas came at the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943. The Japanese had sent a convoy of 8 troop transports and 8 destroyers to reinforce their garrisons in New Guinea. Allied reconnaissance spotted them moving through the sea, and General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, saw a golden opportunity. He ordered Pappy Gunn's modified B-25s and A-20 Havocs to attack using the new low-level tactics. It was a bold plan. Never before had the U.S. attempted a full-scale air assault from such low altitude. The results were beyond anything the Allies could have imagined. Gunn's B-25s swept in at mast height, blazing away with their forward guns. The sheer wall of lead tore through the decks of the transports, knocking out anti-aircraft guns and setting fires. As the ships tried to evade, skip bombs smashed into their hulls. In just 2 days, nearly the entire Japanese convoy was wiped out. Thousands of troops went down with their ships, and the ocean burned with oil and debris. American losses were minimal. For the first time, the Japanese Navy realized that their convoys were no longer safe, not even under the cover of their destroyers. The success of the Bismarck Sea Battle turned Pappy Gunn into a legend. His designs and tactics were now being studied by engineers and strategists across the Pacific. The Army Air Forces began producing official B-25G and B-25H variants based directly on his modifications. These versions featured solid metal noses with automatic cannons, side-mounted machine guns, and armor plating. The B-25H, in particular, carried an incredible amount of firepower, a 75mm cannon plus 14.50 caliber guns. It was one of the most heavily armed aircraft of the entire war. But what made Gunn truly remarkable was not just his technical skill, it was his understanding of tactics. He trained pilots personally, teaching them how to use the planes in combat. He insisted that attacks be made at high speed in coordinated groups, with one section firing to suppress defenses while another made bombing runs. His approach combined precision, aggression, and teamwork, the exact traits that gave the U.S. Air Forces the edge they needed. The Japanese, meanwhile, were caught completely off guard. Their doctrine had focused on high-altitude defense, where Zero fighters excelled. But these low-level assaults neutralized their advantages. Their guns couldn't depress low enough, and their ships lacked the armor to withstand direct strafing fire. In desperation, they began arming merchant ships with extra guns, painting camouflage on their decks, and sailing only at night. Yet nothing seemed to stop the relentless attacks. Allied intelligence began intercepting messages from Japanese commanders, thus describing the B-25 raids as unpredictable storms of steel. The power of the B-25 gunships wasn't limited to the sea. They were also devastating against ground targets. Gunn's aircraft began flying low-level raids on Japanese airfields, fuel depots, and truck convoys. Their combination of speed and firepower made them almost untouchable. In some cases, the B-25s came in so low, Gunn's innovations soon inspired copycats in other theaters. In Europe, American engineers studied the concept for ground attack missions. In the Pacific, Australian and British air units adopted similar modifications. What began as one man's field experiment had now become an official strategy across the Allied forces. His ideas blurred the line between bomber and fighter, creating a new class of attack aircraft that would influence military aviation for decades. Behind the scenes, however, Gunn continued to battle military bureaucracy. Many senior officers still disliked his informal methods. He often ignored orders, modified planes without authorization, and refused to fill out paperwork. But even his critics couldn't deny the results. General Kenney often defended him, saying, "He breaks rules, but he breaks the enemy too." Gunn's reputation as a maverick only grew. He became known as the man who fought the war with a wrench in one hand and a gun in the other. The impact of his work went far beyond the battlefield. The success of the B-25 gunships boosted morale across the 5th Air Force. Pilots who had once flown missions with outdated planes now had a weapon they trusted. They felt confident, even fearless. The results showed in their performance. Accuracy improved, losses dropped, and enemy convoys were destroyed before they reached their destinations. In the words of one pilot, flying one of Pappy's planes felt like holding lightning in your hands. By late 1943, the Japanese shipping lanes in the Southwest Pacific were collapsing. Supply convoys could barely move without being attacked. Airfields were under constant threat. The once dominant Imperial Japanese Navy now struggled to protect its own soldiers. The tide had begun to turn, not just because of superior numbers, but because of innovation, creativity, and one man's refusal to accept limitations. For the men who flew Pappy Gunn's B-25s, every mission carried his spirit. His hands had built their planes, his ideas had shaped their tactics, and his courage had given them hope. In every burst of gunfire and every sinking ship, there was a piece of Pappy's vision, a belief that with the right mix of brains, bravery, and steel, even ordinary men could do extraordinary things. The skies over the Pacific roared with thunder as American bombers descended low, not from the heavens, but just above the waves. Their machine guns screamed fire, shredding Japanese convoys that thought they were safe. These weren't ordinary bombers. They were transformed into flying beasts, carrying 14 forward-firing .50 caliber guns. And the man behind this terrifying invention? A wild, brilliant, and fearless genius named Pappy Gunn, the man who changed how America fought in the Pacific. Pappy Gunn wasn't your typical officer. He wasn't a scientist in a clean white lab or a general sitting behind a map. He was a hands-on problem solver, a pilot, a mechanic, and a mad inventor all in one. Before the war, he had worked as a civilian pilot in the Philippines, flying mail and supplies across islands. But when World War II exploded and the Japanese invaded the Philippines, Gunn found himself right in the middle of chaos. He escaped capture, joined General Douglas MacArthur's forces, and soon became famous for his wild courage and unorthodox ideas. When American bombers like the B-25 Mitchell were first sent to the Pacific, they were designed to fly high, drop bombs, and leave. But in the Pacific, things were different. The Japanese were masters of camouflage and mobility. Their convoys hugged the coast, hid under the jungle canopy, and scattered the moment they saw enemy aircraft. Traditional bombing runs weren't working. Gunn saw it firsthand. He watched bombs splash harmlessly into the ocean while Japanese ships kept moving. Something had to change. Pappy Gunn believed in one simple thing: if it doesn't work, make it work. He wasn't afraid to tear apart military equipment, even if it meant breaking every rule in the book. So he looked at the B-25, a reliable medium bomber, and thought, what if I turn this into a flying gunship? Instead of dropping bombs from high above, it would swoop in low and unleash a wall of bullets. At first, the idea sounded insane. The B-25 already carried a nose gun and a few side-mounted turrets. But Gunn wanted more. He took the bomber apart at the airfield in Australia, using whatever tools and scrap he could find. When Gunn rolled out his first modified bomber, everyone on the base stared in disbelief. The plane looked like a monster. Metal plates bolted on, extra gun barrels sticking out like fangs. But when it flew, it changed everything. During its first test run, the modified B-25 shredded a line of barrels placed on the runway in seconds. The firepower was incredible. Word spread quickly, and MacArthur's command wanted to see what this Frankenstein bomber could do in combat. The real test came in early 1943. Japanese convoys were supplying their troops in New Guinea, long chains of transports protected by destroyers and anti-aircraft guns. Normally, these convoys were difficult targets, but now Pappy Gunn's modified B-25s were ready. The mission was simple but dangerous. Fly low, hit fast, and destroy everything that moved. When the bombers approached the target area, Japanese lookouts spotted them and assumed they were traditional high-altitude bombers. Anti-aircraft gunners prepared for bombs. not for what came next. Instead of climbing to drop bombs, Gunn's bombers roared in barely above the waves. Streams of .50 caliber bullets tore through the decks of Japanese ships, cutting down crews and setting fires before the enemy could react. In seconds, entire convoys were in chaos. Ships burned, supplies exploded, and Japanese sailors scrambled for cover. The attack method that Pappy helped invent became known as skip bombing. Instead of dropping bombs from high altitude, the B-25s would release them just above the water, letting the bombs bounce along the surface like stones before slamming into the sides of ships. Combined with the wall of machine gun fire, this tactic turned American bombers into deadly ship killers. Pappy Gunn's innovation didn't just save missions, it changed Pacific air warfare completely. His modified bombers proved that low-altitude, high-speed strikes could devastate enemy convoys more effectively than traditional tactics. The Japanese, who had once considered their shipping lanes relatively safe, now faced constant threat from these flying gunships. Convoys that once traveled in daylight began moving only at night, fearing another attack from Gunn's creations. Even the official manufacturers of the B-25 back in the U.S. North American aviation took notice. When they heard about what Gunn had done in the field, they sent engineers to study his work. Soon they began producing new models, the B-25G and B-25H, which included many of Pappy's field modifications straight from the factory. These newer versions carried heavy cannons and up to 14 forward-firing guns, making them some of the most heavily armed aircraft of World War II. But Pappy Gunn's story wasn't just about machines, it was about attitude. He represented the daring spirit of those who refused to accept impossible. He didn't wait for orders or permissions. He simply found ways to make things work. Many officers thought he was reckless, but the results spoke for themselves. His men loved him because he led from the front. He flew missions himself, tested his modified planes personally, and risked his life to make sure his ideas worked. There were stories of him flying through storms to deliver spare parts, working 20-hour days in makeshift hangars, and even scrounging scrap metal from wrecked aircraft to arm his creations. The man was unstoppable, a one-man factory of innovation. By mid-1943, Pappy Gunn's gunship bombers were a key part of the Allied offensive in the Southwest Pacific. His ideas helped pave the way for the devastating air attacks that cut off Japanese supply lines, weakened their island defenses, and helped clear the path for MacArthur's return to the Philippines. But perhaps the most remarkable part of Gunn's legacy was how much he achieved without the backing of massive laboratories or huge budgets. His workshop was often a jungle airstrip, his equipment salvaged, his blueprints drawn in the dirt. Yet his modifications influenced the entire design philosophy of Allied air power. He proved that creativity and courage could be just as powerful as factories and resources. Pappy Gunn's story spread across the Pacific like wildfire. Pilots talked about the man who had turned the ordinary B-25 into a flying beast, a 14-gun monster that could shred ships, trucks, and even ground positions with unmatched ferocity. Every time a convoy went up in flames, the legend of Pappy Gunn grew stronger. As Pappy Gunn's deadly B-25s took to the skies, the true test of his wild invention came during one of the most dramatic air battles in the Pacific, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943. It was here that his modified gunship bombers proved their worth and changed the very nature of aerial warfare. The Japanese were trying to reinforce their troops in New Guinea. They had assembled a convoy of 8 transport ships and 80 destroyers, carrying thousands of soldiers and tons of supplies. Their mission was simple: reach Lae, a Japanese stronghold, and strengthen the defense lines against Allied attacks. But what they didn't know was that the Allies had been watching and waiting. American and Australian reconnaissance planes spotted the convoy as it moved through the Bismarck Sea. Immediately, MacArthur's air forces began preparing a massive strike. Yet this wasn't going to be a traditional high-altitude bombing run. This time they would use the new tactics pioneered by Pappy Gunn: low-level attacks with modified B-25s packed with machine guns and skip-bombing tactics that would catch the enemy off guard. The morning of March 3, 1943, dawned with clear skies. The Japanese convoy moved cautiously, destroyers guarding their transports tightly. They expected air attacks, but not what was coming. Suddenly, radar operators picked up fast-approaching aircraft. In minutes, the horizon filled with American and Australian planes, A-20 Havocs, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and most importantly, Pappy Gunn's heavily armed B-25 Mitchells. The first wave came in high. B-17s dropped bombs from altitude, scattering the Japanese formation. But then, from the direction of the rising sun, came the low-flying B-25s. Flying barely above the ocean's surface, they charged straight toward the enemy ships. The Japanese gunners scrambled to aim, but the speed and angle of the attack left them stunned. As the bombers got close, their 14 guns unleashed a storm of bullets. The decks of Japanese ships erupted in chaos. Sailors cut down, weapons silenced, fires breaking out everywhere. Then came the real punch. The pilots released their bombs at just the right moment, letting them skip across the waves like stones before slamming into the sides of transports. Massive explosions ripped through the convoy. Within minutes, Japanese destroyers and transports were burning, some breaking apart, others desperately trying to turn away. One Japanese survivor later described it as hell falling from the sky. Ships that had survived previous Allied air raids were now shredded within minutes. The combination of heavy gunfire and skip bombing was simply unstoppable. The air was filled with smoke, flames, and debris. Allied aircraft made repeated passes, finishing off damaged ships and strafing survivors who tried to escape in lifeboats. By the end of the day, all 8 Japanese transports and 4 destroyers were sunk. More than 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were lost, a devastating blow to their operations in New Guinea. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea became one of the most one-sided naval air battles of the entire Pacific War. And at the heart of this destruction was Pappy Gunn's genius in his modified B-25s. The success stunned both sides. Allied commanders were amazed by how effective low-level attacks had been. They had never seen bombers deliver such concentrated firepower to such close range. Pilots who once flew traditional bombing runs now wanted to fly the Gunship B-25s, calling them the most exciting and deadly aircraft in the theater. The Japanese, meanwhile, were shocked and terrified. Their anti-aircraft tactics had been designed for high-altitude bombers, not low-level, fast-moving gun platforms that could tear through convoys like wolves among sheep. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea became a turning point. It proved that air power, when used with creativity and aggression, could destroy naval forces without a single ship in sight. For General MacArthur's Air Command, it was a game changer. They realized that Pappy Gunn's modifications weren't just clever, they were revolutionary. From that point onward, the concept of strafer bombers, planes designed to attack ground and sea targets with heavy guns, became a standard strategy. Pappy Gunn's B-25s soon gained legendary status across the Pacific. They were used to strike Japanese airfields, shipping routes, and island bases. Pilots flew so low during attacks that their propellers sometimes splashed seawater. They called it mast-top flying, meaning they flew just above the tallest mast of a ship. It was incredibly dangerous, one mistake, and what made these bombers so effective wasn't just their firepower. It was the combination of speed, surprise, and precision. Japanese convoys were trained to look for high-altitude bombers. They weren't prepared for aircraft roaring in just above the ocean. The psychological effect was devastating. Sailors often froze in panic as the incoming planes filled the sky with tracers. By the time they reacted, it was already too late. Word of these new tactics spread quickly throughout the Allied air forces. Soon, other units in the Pacific began modifying their aircraft using Pappy's designs. His ideas even influenced other bomber types, such as the A-20 Havoc and the later A-26 Innovator, both of which were used for low-level attacks. For the Japanese, the lesson was bitter. They had underestimated the flexibility of American engineering and the creativity of pilots in the field. Their convoys became more cautious and their supply lines weaker. Every transport that left port now risked being hunted down by these gunship bombers. Japan's army on the islands began suffering from lack of food, ammunition, and fuel, a slow but deadly consequence of Pappy Gunn's work. The Americans had finally found a way to strike the Japanese where it hurt most, their logistics. Every destroyed convoy meant troops starving on remote islands and less resistance during Allied landings. The Bismarck Sea victory proved that innovation could be more powerful than numbers. But Pappy Gunn wasn't satisfied. He kept experimenting. He wanted even more firepower, more speed, more accuracy. His mind never stopped thinking of ways to improve his planes. And while his superiors sometimes were worried that he was too reckless, they also knew he was a genius who delivered results no one else could. He became something of a legend, a man whose mechanical magic and fearless attitude helped win the air war in the Pacific. As the war thundered on, Pappy Gunn's reputation spread across every American airfield in the Pacific. His B-25 gunships had proven themselves as the most lethal weapons against Japanese supply lines, and now everyone wanted a piece of his genius. But for Pappy, this was never about fame or recognition. It was about results. He believed that every plane should be as deadly and effective as possible, and if that meant breaking rules or bending orders, he was more than ready to do it. His workshop in Australia became a kind of mechanical laboratory, but unlike a scientific facility, it was noisy, smoky, and chaotic. Pappy's crew worked day and night, cutting through metal, testing weapons, and experimenting with new layouts. Spare parts were scarce, so Gunn often scavenged from damaged aircraft or enemy wrecks. When the supplies ran out, he made his own solutions. He used truck batteries for electrical systems, reshaped metal plates by hand, and welded mounts for extra machine guns directly onto the aircraft's fuselage. His workshop became legendary. Pilots called it Gunn's Jungle Factory. One of his boldest experiments came when he decided to replace the nose of the B-25 with a solid armored version fitted with even heavier guns. He was inspired by the devastating power of naval cannons and thought, why not put one on an airplane? That wild idea led to one of the most terrifying upgrades in aviation history, the addition of a 75mm cannon on the B-25. This wasn't a machine gun. It was the same kind of gun found on tanks, capable of blowing holes straight through ships and bunkers. Many thought it was impossible. How could a bomber handle the recoil of such a massive weapon? But Gunn didn't believe in impossible. He modified the nose, reinforced the structure, and rebalanced the plane. When the first test was fired, the entire aircraft shook. But it worked. The cannon fired straight and true, and the idea became the foundation for the next major model, the B-25G, followed by the even deadlier B-25H, which carried both the cannon and 14 machine guns. Now, the B-25 wasn't just a bomber, it was a flying battleship. Crews nicknamed it Pappy's Puncher. In the hands of skilled pilots, it could tear apart enemy ships, destroy coastal defenses, and flatten ground positions. The Japanese began to fear even the sound of its engines, because they knew what was coming. Every low-flying twin-engine stories of his bravery became legendary. Once, when supplies were desperately needed at a forward base, Pappy flew through a storm alone, dodging Japanese patrols just to deliver spare parts. On another occasion, after one of his modified B-25s was damaged, he landed it himself on a rough strip, patched it overnight with his crew, and flew it again the next morning. He had an unshakable belief that if something could be done, it should be done, right now. His connection with General MacArthur also grew stronger. MacArthur recognized that Pappy was no ordinary officer. He was an innovator who could give the Allies a massive advantage. While others focused on following orders, Gunn focused on rewriting the rules of warfare. MacArthur once said that Pappy's modifications gave our men the tools to strike harder, faster, and more decisively than ever before. As the Allies advanced through New Guinea, the Philippines, and the Pacific Islands, Gunn's modified aircraft played a crucial role. They weren't just used for attacking convoys anymore. They destroyed airfields, strafed enemy troops, and blasted fortifications before amphibious landings. The low-level strafer tactics became standard procedure for Allied air units across the region. Japanese commanders began to refer to these planes as angry hornets. Their appearance almost always meant disaster. Entire supply fleets stopped sailing in daylight because of them. They even began dispersing troops at night and hiding ships in coves to avoid being spotted by reconnaissance planes. But it was no use. By 1944, Pappy Gunn's innovation had already crippled Japan's ability to move men and materials freely. The empire that once dominated the Pacific was now struggling just to survive. Despite his growing fame, Pappy remained humble and fiercely devoted to his men. He often worked alongside mechanics, covered in grease and sweat, eating the same rations as everyone else. Pilots who served under him said that he treated every man equally, whether a new recruit or a senior officer. His charisma, combined with his fearless nature, made him one of the most respected figures in the entire Southwest Pacific Command. He also had a mischievous sense of humor. Once, when a superior officer criticized his unapproved modifications, Pappy simply grinned and replied, "Sir, if it works, you can call it anything you like." And it did work, over and over again. His results silenced every critic who doubted him. By this stage of the war, the factory back home had fully adopted his ideas. The U.S. was now mass-producing versions of the B-25 with its design improvements straight from the assembly line. But while thousands of planes carried his innovations, Pappy himself preferred to keep working in the field. He said he didn't want to sit behind a desk in Washington. He wanted to stay where the action was. In 1944, his designs and tactics had become so widespread that even other Allied air forces, including the Royal Australian Air Force, adopted them. His B-25 supported ground troops, sank ships, and obliterated enemy columns retreating through the jungles. It was said that wherever Gunn's bombers went, Japanese resistance soon crumbled. But beyond the guns, the smoke, and the explosions, there was something deeply human about Pappy Gunn's story. He wasn't a trained engineer. He didn't have fancy degrees or advanced technology. What he had was experience, courage, and imagination. He represented a kind of wartime genius that came from necessity, when survival depended on thinking faster and acting bolder than the enemy. By the end of 1944, his B-25s had rewritten the rules of the air war in the Pacific. From a standard medium bomber, he had created one of the most versatile and deadly aircraft of the entire conflict. And as American forces pushed closer to the Philippines, Pappy was already thinking about the next challenge: how to support MacArthur's long-promised return to his homeland. By late 1944, the Pacific War had turned decisively in favor of the Allies. Japan's empire was shrinking, its navy shattered, and its air power crumbling. The island-hopping strategy was working, and now all eyes turned toward one goal: the return to the Philippines. For General MacArthur, it was personal, and for Pappy Gunn, it was even more so. The Philippines had once been his home, where his family had lived before the Japanese invasion. For him, this wasn't just another mission. It was about redemption, revenge, and bringing freedom back to the place he loved most.